Thank you for that very kind welcome. Yeah, I'm Louisa Parks. I work here. I used to work in Lincoln. I'm originally from Nottingham in the UK. And exactly, I've been working, it's very kind to say the last few years, it's been about 20, that I've been working on environmental activism, how it shapes European Union policy, what the different ideas are that climate activists try to bring to the table, and how they might be part of ideas about how to transform our governance systems in various different ways, because I think one thing that we probably all agree on by virtue of being here today is that things do need to get better. We do need to do more. How we do more is the question that I think climate activists try to answer. And the focus today is really going to be on pro-climate action activism. So folks who sometimes might even be against certain policies, but for the reason that they don't feel those policies go far enough to actually solve some of the problems that we're facing in terms of planetary crisis. But I also do want to say a little bit at the end about backlash to climate action, climate skepticism. Climate denialism is a little bit more rare as a beast in Europe, but certainly climate skepticism is something that is coming up quite forcefully at the moment, at the end of a very strong pro-climate protest wave, which I'd like to explore a little bit today. So let's have a little look what we're going to talk about. I'm going to try and do the boring bit first. So in terms of what is this idea of just transition, how does that link to broader ideas we have in environmental governance, particularly the discourse, the political discourse of sustainable development. I'd like us to try and think about what sustainable development actually is and what it isn't. What are we sustaining? What shouldn't we be sustaining? Who should we sustain the lifestyle of, and where and how, etc. I think that would be a nice, discussion we could have at the end, linking that to ideas of just transition, and then what has this got to do with activism? So we can trace in quite interesting ways how the idea of just transition, which is quite a buzzword in terms of European Union policy at the moment, actually is born in activism, and it's born in trade union activism in the United States, of all places right now, back in the 1970s. So we can have a look at how these different political discourses of how to do environmental protection, let's say, are born in important ways within stories of activism, different kinds of activism. I'd like to have a little look at the history of that movement, and then a little bit more of a dig into how different political discourses are coming together in climate justice and environmental justice ideas in movements today. Tie it back to the idea of just transition, and then focus on a few of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. But many of those challenges come out by looking at the differences in political ideas held by large international organisations compared to the political ideas held by some of the activists who are pushing against those systems. But there are also moments of crossover, moments of uptake that can give us a bit of a glimpse into how activism does actually shape and change institutions and the way that we think about environmental governance and action against climate change. So that's the plan. Let's see how far we get, and if I start talking for too long, they will kindly ask me to be quiet, and obviously please just butt in whenever you wish to with questions or comments, and that'll probably make it more interesting. Okay, so where do we start in terms of where we are in Europe, at least the European Union, so not my home country, right now, in terms of environmental governance? Well, the latest step that we took was in 2019 with the European Green Deal, which I don't know if you've covered in the last couple of days, maybe not.
No, really.
I'll say something about it then. So the European Green Deal is a huge policy and also political programme, which was announced by, well, she's still the Commission President now, Ursula von der Leyen, but in her first term, so right at the beginning of her first term in late 2019. it's actually the product of a deal with the European Parliament, who were a little bit annoyed that von der Leyen was being chosen as a candidate. We won't get into that, but they said, all right, we will approve you if you bring us a big policy programme on environmental protection. Lo and behold, the European Green Deal. There's interesting language in the European Green Deal. If you're interested in politics, if you're interested in activism, if you're interested in political discourses, so ideas of how we do governance. The European Green Deal contains a huge amount of information about what we're going to do about reducing GHG emissions, becoming a climate neutral economy in Europe by 2050 with quite clear plans about how to do that, how we are going to transition away from fossil fuel-based energy sources, how we are going to act to save European biodiversity, how we are going to also protect people who will lose out from these changes, these policy changes, etc., etc., clean our economy, build circular economies. It's a massive, massive programme. But it's described as a growth strategy, right? Now, probably you've been talking about sustainable development, and sustainable development is the idea that you can have your cake and eat it, right? It's a win-win situation. You can carry on as long as you pay some attention to doing what you do in different, more sustainable ways, right? So we protect what we have for future generations. There's an intergenerational element there. You can carry on your lifestyle. We can grow through green policies. So it's a growth strategy that aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society, I guess we weren't before, with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. So it's quite, this is clearly quite economic talk, right? But there are going to be no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050, and we will decouple economic growth from resource use. Now, when we get to activism, this becomes a big bone of contention, because many climate activists do not buy the idea that you can achieve decoupling, right? That economic growth can in many ways be decoupled from resource use, but not entirely. Not completely, but that most of the reasoning that we can't do that is because of very deeply embedded logics of how we understand our well-being, how we understand our lives to be full of worth, how we allocate value to things in our lives are often tied to ideas of economic gain. We can see this also, in ideas of, breadwinning and who has most value in gender systems, etc., right? It also aims to protect, conserve and enhance the EU's natural capital, protect the health and well-being of citizens, but this is mostly through economic action, from environmental related risks and impacts, and at the same time this transition must be just and inclusive. So we're tying together a lot of things. Economic growth, human well-being and social justice, so a just transition, which they describe as leaving no one behind elsewhere, but also environmental protection. So we can do all three of these things. That's the idea of the European Green Deal. Quite a lot has been done on the European Green Deal. The Climate Act has been pushed through. It was managed to get through the pandemic. It managed to get through the invasion of Ukraine more or less intact until about 2023, 2024, when we started to see backlash against parts of the European Green Deal, and particularly around biodiversity protection and the idea that farmers should keep aside some of their land for nature protection reasons. And that did not go down well. So we're starting to see a bit of a backlash against this now. But an extraordinary amount of legislation did pass, and legislation that we were quite surprised that it got through the council quite so easily. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but this is the backdrop, if you like, the idea of the European Green Deal. And within that, we have the idea of just transition. Another interesting thing about the Green Deal is the ambition that it's going to be exported outside Europe's borders. So there are parts of the European Green Deal that are at the edges of Europe and expect countries who import into Europe to pay taxes where they are importing highly fossil fuel dependent or resource heavy products, steel, aluminium, etc., etc. And there's also a lot of climate diplomacy going on. So another question that is being talked about, particularly in the climate activism, climate justice movement, is how far Europe should be the one to be pushing the idea of sustainable development in countries which European countries were responsible, frankly, for plundering and invading in the colonial past. But also how far the European Union is then seen as a neo-colonial actor itself by imposing these ideas outside its borders, and how the European Union's own transition may only be possible if we are dependent on services and products that are produced in dirtier ways outside Europe's borders. Where do we send our plastic waste? Where do we get the lithium for our electric cars? What happens in the mining towns where we extract lithium, copper, cobalt in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Chile or Bolivia, etc. So how far is our idea of sustainable development dependent on the sacrifice of others? And how fair is that? Is a big question in the climate movement. Just transition, as Europe, as the European Union has constructed it and imagined it, and to be honest, this is because the European Union is an economic organisation, so obviously it has to imagine these things in terms of money and funds and how we can help people through changing policies. It's a proposition to make the transition fair in terms of a transition to a climate neutral economy, and it's very much targeted to certain regions in Europe where communities are economically dependent on fossil fuel production or on very fossil fuel dependent industries, which would be coal mining towns in Poland and parts of Germany, places like this. It mobilises around 55 billion euros across this sort of time frame, and this is sort of invested in different ways. But let's put that in a bit of comparative focus, because I always find it difficult when I see billions of euros. I think, fabulous. How much have they promised for Rearm Europe? Does anybody?
55 billion.
800.
Yeah, up to 800 billion euros. So for arms we can find 800 billion euros. For the just transition we find relatively less. This is another challenge I'd like us to talk about, is how do you understand climate change as a tangible and existential threat that is comparable to something that feels as dangerous and as close as, I don't know, whatever you fear right now in international geopolitics. There are lots of choices there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is another challenge of climate change, is that we've always talked about it in policy terms as we're going to achieve this by this year. We're going to achieve this percentage of cuts by this year. We're going to get back to 1990 levels by this year. We tend to project it into the future, and I could hear a few people chatting about this while we were waiting to start. It's already here. The glaciers are disappearing, I think you guys were talking about, right? Climate change and the impacts of climate change are already here, right? So how do we, but we can't see an enemy. We can't see a particular way of doing this. It's complex, it's tricky, it's very, very difficult, and people have very different ideas about how to resolve that. All true, also true of most political problems if we get beneath the surface, right? So this is another question I'd like us to think about maybe in the next few hours. There are also various just transition plans and platforms, and it's supposed to go to people, right? So people in these particular areas that are very tied to fossil fuels, and it's going to go into re-educating, training, building new industries by giving subsidies and grants, etc., for the development of new types of industry, or for existing industry to convert into different types of production, etc., etc. So this is the idea of just transition in the European Union. Try and hold that in your brain so then we can see what it looks like in the trade union movement, because it comes from quite a different, well, not that different. Now let's get to activism. That's enough of the EU, I think, for 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Environmental activism is something that, I mean, maybe not for us, but certainly when I teach my undergrads and master's students, feels quite recent. They very much connect it to Fridays for Future, and a very new thing, a very young thing that has been, quite recently evolving on the international stage. But of course, environmental activism has a very long history, and some of that history can be useful for us to understand what kinds of ideas are now coming up in what I call the fourth wave of climate activism around the idea of environmental and climate justice. There are different ideas in there, and I think they can be quite interesting to explore, so bear with me. I'll try not to go on for too long, but I want to really concentrate on the most recent wave, but to understand the most recent wave, we have to go back quite far, at least in life. Environmental activism doesn't start with social movements. It doesn't start with protest so much. It starts with something that we might equate with something that looks like an NGO today. So more advocacy oriented, a bit more polite, let's say, in terms of the kinds of action taken. And it really evolves with large waves of urbanisation around the turn of the century, and the idea that workers should have green spaces to recreate, to relax at the weekend, to enjoy nature. So ideas that we have a right to nature and a right to that sort of well-being. Ideas that I think we've probably forgotten about until about the pandemic, when we all suddenly realised that having a garden was a massive privilege, right? And that it really does help us to feel better. So this kind of conservationism, I have more slides on this, I'll move a bit faster, then moves into something more protest-oriented around the 1968 wave, the new left wave of protests that starts with, well, from civil rights movements in America in the 1950s, and then spills over, if you like, into peace activism against the war in Vietnam, into various rights movements around reclaiming the identity of being a woman, being gay, etc., turns into huge student movements against sort of the old establishment, if you like, particularly in France, Germany and Italy. Trento, massive centre of student protest. If anyone's interested, you can have a look, go hang out at the sociology department, where lots of things happened, not all of them very peaceful. But it's part of this wave, so it's sort of building from this moment, and of course it's very much linked to the Cold War, this protest wave, and turns also into anti-nuclear demonstrations and actions. But we'll have a little bit of a look at that in a second as well. With the end of the Cold War and the construction of institutions of global governance, so I mean, let's not forget how divided we were in the Cold War, and I know I was quite young when the Cold War ended, but the idea that the whole world could theoretically sign a treaty about climate change wasn't possible until about the early 1990s, and lo and behold, in the early 1990s, also as part of the agenda-setting action of environmental movements, this is when we see the 3 Rio treaties. So the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, I never quite know how to say it, but you know what I mean, stopping deserts forming, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The 3 Rio treaties are signed in 1992, and there is a clear reason for that. That provides opportunities for activists to turn back into advocacy organisations and get into the corridors, get into those spaces and try to shape those structures from the inside. as those treaties progress and other international organisations, countries, etc., appear to be falling behind, to put it diplomatically, in terms of their implementation of those treaties, in terms of hitting the goals that we've set ourselves around climate change, biodiversity, protection, etc., that's when we see this move back to protest. But the general point I want to make by outlining this as a very, very general idea of a wave of protest to advocacy over time is the idea that this is politically rational action. This isn't spontaneous. It isn't just gut feeling. It isn't just kids complaining or feeling that they aren't listened to. It's politically logical, and it moves with institutional building in a symbiotic fashion, right? The big idea here that I want to underline is that social movements, protest, activism of all kinds of different types, more and less polite, are a normal part of democratic politics in Europe and beyond. They always have been, and they are very important to democratic politics. So making space for that when we talk about what it is to be an active citizen, or what it is to have our point of view put across, this is part of normal politics, right? Then there's a whole debate on where it is okay to cross the boundaries of the law, depending on what the law is. That's a very difficult conversation to have. Some laws people feel are morally wrong, etc. We'll talk about those when we talk about challenges as well. But they're, interesting things to think about. So politically rational action that is trying to change the way that we shape institutions at global, international, national, local level, in conversation with those institutions in more and less contentious waves over time. To understand the kind of arguments that we see in climate justice activism today, it can be useful to take a bit of a look at what the ideas are, what the political discourses are in these different waves. If we go way back to the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, we find quite polite campaigns, letter writing, lobbying MPs, etc. Campaigns to save and conserve particular species, which people are starting to realise are disappearing, and to found national parks, exactly for this idea that you need access to nature, which is a lovely thing to do, right? There is some problems in here in terms of how it was used politically. Okay, so one of the big examples of national park founding is the Yellowstone National Park in the United States, very much in the news at the moment because they've sacked everyone who works there, right? They've sacked a lot of park staff. It's quite sad. But these parks, at the moment of their foundation, are about the idea, the romantic idea with a capital R, that nature is wild, is pristine, that the kind of nature we should value and need access to is untouched by humans. Now this is what we can describe as a Cartesian divide or a nature-culture divide, the idea that the environment is something over there that I should act to protect, but I'm not part of it, right? I'm not part of that natural system. What this turns into with the founding of national parks is fencing off land, which various groups of people have actually been responsible for stewarding, shaping, and looking after, often for many hundreds of years prior. That's a little less obvious in the US case, though some indigenous folks were moved in the foundation of these parks. When park foundation moves into colonies, European colonies in particular, it becomes politically mobilised to remove political agency from local communities, and those communities are forcibly displaced from the land. Which is not what we might think would be the roots of climate activism, right? So it's a difficult history, but it helps us understand why climate justice, environmental justice discourses today are trying to engage and own with some of those problems that are quite old in that sense. But it is something that's very much still under discussion today. I think you get these slides at some point if you want to watch some videos from NGOs talking about the militarization of national park protection, particularly in Africa, in the DRC. There are some videos there. The second wave looks really, really, really different to that because it's exactly growing out of these peace movements. And it's not hard to see how, you know, it's epitomised by Greenpeace. It's green, it's peace, it's Greenpeace, right? The environment is also a question of justice, a question of peace, a question of how we live in the world and, you know, manage violence, etc. So very much something about the Cold War. So Greenpeace, I've got a video there as well if you want to take a trip back in time and see Greenpeace on their boats trying to stop whaling and nuclear testing, etc. This comes up in the idea that there are environmental impacts of conflict. In terms of the Vietnam War, in the use of napalm, in the use of Agent Orange, which are of course still causing terrible problems in Vietnam today, and obviously in nuclear testing in the arms race in the Cold War. So Greenpeace is one of the groups, then splits off also into Sea Shepherd, which is more about protecting whales from Japanese whaling ships, also Norwegian whaling ships back in the day. It's an idea of putting yourself peacefully in the way, right? So those ships go out into the sea and they sit in nuclear testing sites, or then further on down the line they sit in front of whalers. They make, you know, big statements using a few people passively resisting something and using their bodies to try to make a point. You see where I'm going with this, right? There are long histories behind the kinds of activism we see today. End of the Cold War, of course, we build those global governance institutions. As I said, I've already been talking too long. And this is where we see a big turn. So we see this usually at the end of protest waves, that lots of parts of social movements turn into NGOs, for want of a better moniker, okay? NGOs means everything and nothing, right? But these kinds of non-governmental, more formally organised, more advocacy-oriented kind of insider groups who work inside systems to try and bring pressure about various points that they care about. So that's what we see in this sort of third wave, if you like, of environmental activism. We see NGOs engaged in those processes, but also becoming big project promoters. So working on the ground around environmental projects, often with funds that they get from the international organisations that they've been trying to shape over the decades, and working on the ground, particularly when states have come to an impasse in decision making. We see this in the UN system as a turn to partnership-based approaches, whole of society approaches, where we use other actors, non-state actors, who are present and able to work with people to actually achieve something on the ground, rather than these large state-based negotiations, which, as we all know, can be blocked for reasons that have nothing to do with how much you want to protect the environment. It might be to do with what's happening in another negotiation elsewhere. Okay, that brings us to the current wave. So we've got quite different ideas of how to shape environmental governance in these different waves. We've gone from a kind of make a park, fence it off and look after wild nature, into passive resistance to state violence, etc., into let's work with the system to build a global approach to environmental governance. What happens in the fourth wave is a moment, let's say, of disappointment about what is happening in multilateral institutions. So those Rio treaties we spoke about. Those moments of disappointment really crystallise around between 2010 and 2015. Well, even a bit earlier than that, an important moment of disappointment, if you like, for at least these NGO folks who are quite engaged in these multilateral processes, is the Copenhagen COP, Conference of the Parties, of the UNFCCC, so the Climate Change Convention, in 2009. And this is the first COP that didn't make a joint final statement. The states couldn't agree even on a political statement to put out to the media, essentially, at the end of that meeting. So there was a minority statement from a few big, important states. And you know, they did achieve things. You know, when you look back in retrospect, a lot of important things came out of Copenhagen. But it's seen as a political kind of failure by these guys. And with that, and it's also seen as a political failure by a lot of politicians, and that's when we got all of the background work that eventually ends up in the Paris Agreement of 2015, which of course is a much more hopeful moment. But it's a moment where NGOs who are engaged very much with these processes, not necessarily accepting or always entirely optimistic, they're certainly critical, but they suddenly think, should we be doing something else? Should we simply be trying to achieve this in different ways? Because we're stuck. We're not getting things done in the way that we feel things should be being done. So what they do is they have a moment of reflection. They have a moment of looking back and looking around, and also trying to conscientiously build larger coalitions with other kinds of struggles around environmental action that have been going on for very many years prior, but are quite local, that are quite locally rooted, and are a bit more contentious. And there are some important ideas going on in there. One of them is the idea of environmental racism. This is an important idea in environmental and climate justice, and it's basically the idea that it is marginalised communities. It's born in the US, so in the US context it's often communities of colour who live the impacts of environmental damage much more close to their own skin, let's put it like that, right? So this famous book, Dumping in Dixie, by Robert Bullard in the 1970s, builds on this idea that often where marginalised communities live are close to rubbish dumps, toxic waste dumps. They may be very far away from health services. There may be big problems with the quality of housing, access to healthcare, education, etc. And it's a beginning of a bridge from the idea that how you live the impacts of environmental damage is very clearly also a social justice issue. We also see this going on in other kinds of struggles in other parts of the world. Again, back into the 70s here. And the idea, and this is a moniker coined by Joan Martinez Alier, who's in Barcelona University, I think, the environmentalism of the poor, which puts this into a kind of international political economy sort of approach. That the global flows of trade are in a sense sort of still colonially shaped by the extraction of raw materials in what we could call the global south. I know that's a contested term, but I'm not quite sure how else to, poorer countries, I guess. Often biodiversity rich countries as well. And used and the value is added to them in the global north. Right, so we take, again, let's go back to electric cars. We take lithium from places often like Bolivia and Chile and Argentina. So that's where some of the most accessible lithium reserves are on the planet, because they're in salt flats. And it's quite easy, relatively easy, to get lithium out of salt flats. It's quite hard to get it out of stone, and it's mostly in stone in Europe. It's the extent of my technical knowledge. Let's not plumb any further into that. But the idea is that they're not building the batteries, right? The Chinese are building the batteries. We were building the batteries, but they went bankrupt a few weeks back, okay, right? The idea is that the value is added in the global north, and this is an old pattern, and it means that there is an unequal distribution of ecological goods and evils, so goods and bads, if you like, resulting from economic growth. You start to think back to the idea of the European Green Deal and the imagery of the European Green Deal, and we start to see that these ideas challenge that view, challenge the possibility that we can have a just transition here. And what's the meaning of a just transition if it's only in Europe? Because these are global problems. Climate change is a global problem, biodiversity loss is a global problem. If we export the bads, if we carry on doing this sort of thing, the argument of activists is now going, it's meaningless to talk about sustainable development on one continent, essentially. It's not possible. Okay, so this is an idea that's also located in, big scientific arguments about planetary limits, planetary boundaries that we've crossed, etc. We've got examples of quite interesting struggles here as well. The Chipko movement, the original tree huggers, right, from India in the 1970s, who are basically environmental protesters asking for access to forests for natural resource use. We've also got some other ideas that are a bit more, I guess, European in outlook, ideas like degrowth, which tries to, I guess, rethink what economic value is, what well-being is, and bring it into an idea of democracy, that we have to take a conscientious, a voluntary, democratically negotiated, equitable downscaling of some kinds of economic accumulation, because they're not making us feel better, essentially. They're destroying our planet. Therefore, if we want to feel good, if we want to feel well, if we maybe want to work a few less hours a week, because let's face it, we're all here on a Saturday morning, right? Maybe we should think about those balances a little bit more, right? Maybe we should scale some stuff back, right? But we won't go into too much. There are lots and lots of struggles and ideas that are sort of sloshing around, let's say, while a bunch of NGOs are quite engaged with multilateral processes. Another thing that starts sloshing around the turn of the millennium is something called the global justice movement, which we might know better as the anti-globalization movement, or no global, etc., right? Which is how the newspapers described it. Of course, they're not against globalization. They're saying some forms of economic globalization create social injustice and we should address that, right? But are they saying it in quite, disruptive ways? Yes, massive protests. So this is interesting for us scholars of social movements, because this, at the turn of the millennium, is the first time that we see transnational protests. We see folks getting together and protesting against international organisations. It's always been states before, really, if any political target at all. It's been states or local governments, etc. The global justice movement, starts off against the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Then we start to see big protests at meetings of the EU Council, at the G7, etc. And of course, some of those protests are quite violent and quite traumatic as well. The other thing that's going on in this movement that is maybe a little bit less known, a little bit less talked about, is the counter-summit movement. So what happens apart from the protests is this idea of social forums. The first World Social Forum was held in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, in 2001. And it's a moment where we start to see movement groups, trade unions, also NGOs, local struggles from those kinds of other movements and struggles that we saw in the previous slides, coming together and talking. This is important for sort of building ideas, right? And cross-contamination. And that goes on up until the sort of moment of disappointment around 2009. We've still got these huge world and European social forums going on. So lots of contamination, lots of people talking to each other, and lots of people making the point that environmental crisis, social injustice, economic growth are very interlinked things. So we start to see where these ideas are coming from. A quick note on just transition, just because it's such a buzzword in Europe at the moment. Just transition is born in a social movement. It's born in the US labor movement by a guy called Tony Mazzocchi, so an Italian immigrant, and I imagine he must have been an Italian immigrant, in the 1970s, or child of. And it's specifically an idea that is created to say there is no necessary trade-off between protecting the environment and having a job, right? This is a common argument we see from a lot of industry players, is that if we protect the environment, people's jobs will be lost. And obviously this is a trade-off that does damage to people, and it's a social injustice issue. The US trade union movement tried to put together the idea of just transition to say exactly that this is not necessarily how things have to go. If we can act to make sure that people are, for example, as in the EU programme, right, retrained, etc., this doesn't have to happen. And also, it's often very much exaggerated by industry players, right? How much jobs will be affected by a policy change that could be absorbed in other ways, right? Not necessarily through layoffs. It's also a social justice programme. It's saying that, you know, if we do change, the social impacts have to be ensured by proper welfare state mechanisms, right? This is how we should be thinking about it, because we cannot compromise on environmental protection. It makes no sense for anybody in the long run, right? There's nothing left to exploit on a dead Earth. There's no planet B, all of these kinds of ideas, right? And they were very successful in getting this idea to spread. So we start to see the idea of just transition taken up in text by the International Labour Organization. It's an objective in the Paris Agreement, just transition as well, which is probably how it then filters down to the European Union. But it's all through trade union activism, so it's quite a strong idea. It's also been adopted by some of those other struggles that we looked at, including indigenous people's struggles, and it kind of comes to cross-contaminate with the idea of environmental justice, this idea of just transition. So it's interesting that it's in European Union documents as well. If we bring all of this together and we fast forward to the fourth wave of environmental activism, it comes under the heading of environmental or climate justice. This is how we see this sort of formation of a master frame around activism at the moment. So they're trying to build a discourse that brings these different ideas together, and it's concerned with the degree to which the environmental risks generated by industrial society fall most heavily on poor and ethnic minorities. There are central elements in theories of environmental justice and how we can tackle this kind of problem about recognitional justice, procedural justice, and distributive justice. Recognitional justice is about listening to the knowledge of others, particularly listening to the knowledge of those who are stewarding parts of the earth and have been for many hundreds of years, and what they might know about how we can act more sustainably. So this is something very much taken up, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which now has just formed a permanent working group for Indigenous peoples and local communities, which has a scientific board, so the equivalent, if you like, of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The version for biodiversity, the IPBES, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, has a whole section for bringing in traditional knowledge into biodiversity conservation. It's also about procedural justice, so how do different voices get listened to in decision making about the environment? And then it's also about ideas of just transition, distributive justice. Who gets the good stuff? Who gets the bad stuff? How do we distribute this fairly? If we think of environmental or climate justice in this kind of view, it's a recipe for how to transform decision making. It really points to the importance of democratic inclusion. It points to the idea that you need to listen and include different points of view, that you need to produce just decisions, etc. So it's an interesting source of thinking, this kind of activism. And it's built through social movements, also academics, but usually activist academics, right? Okay, I'm nearly there, honestly. Okay, I'm going to go really quick here, because I think we all know this, right? What happens around, 2018, Greta Thunberg sits down in front of the parliament, right, in Sweden, and she starts something that is picked up by many different organisations, and it becomes an international network called Fridays for Future, engaging in mass protest and asking for justice, right? Asking for us to create intergenerational justice, which is a form of distributive justice, but it's also a form of recognition and a form of inclusion of people who aren't yet born, right, or who are very young. Also asking us to listen to knowledge. In this sense, you know, Fridays is quite interesting because it particularly singles out sort of, you know, enlightenment-based versions of science. So listen to the science. There's some interesting work on that and how it could be described as a kind of populism. But also increasingly asking for system change, not climate change. I think we've all seen those slogans, right? Change the system, not the climate. This is about transforming decision-making procedures, so it's quite interesting for us. There are, of course, lots and lots of other protest groups who are involved both in these marches and are probably a little bit more radical in their calls for system change. Things like, you know, degrowth movements, climate camps, etc., etc. But there is definitely a kind of zeitgeist moment around 2019 that's kind of cut off in its prime by the pandemic, calling for climate action very strongly. And it's actually name tagged in the European Green Deal. So we have to act because the young people are asking us to, which looks good politically, right? Okay. At the same kind of time, little bit later, we see a new strain of quite disruptive activism, so civil disobedience groups, and in particular, Extinction Rebellion, which is created in the United Kingdom in 2019, I think. I haven't put the date up there. It was about 2019. And they, to be honest, you know, if you look back in history, they look a bit Greenpeace-like. They sit down in the middle of the road, they glue themselves to trains, they annoy you all horrifically in your morning commute, okay, but they're making a point. Where is the value? Where is the action, right? Maybe you can get down the road today, but if there's a massive flood tomorrow and the bridge is broken, let's try and think about these things. They start to create other groups, sort of spin-offs like Just Stop Oil, The Last Generation, La Ultima Generazione, and Letzte Generation in German-speaking countries, who are doing quite similar things, but also start doing things that are probably quite hard to interpret for most of us, like throwing soup on paintings, connecting also to other struggles around racism, etc. But if we look back at these history and these discourses, we start to see why they might be doing that. Why would we throw soup on a painting to make a point about climate change? It's about where we put value in society, right? What do we want to protect? Where do we put our investment? Of course we put it into protecting art. None of those paintings were really damaged because they're protected. It's probably too subtle a point, right? But that's how some of them were doing it, okay? So this is interesting that this sort of civil disobedience is coming up again, and it looks quite similar to what was going on in the 1970s, even the 1980s with mass demonstrations against nuclear missile placement in Europe. So it looks logical in that sense. Whether we want to join in with it, of course, is another question. But there is some political logic to it. And some of the framing, some of the claims are interesting in terms of environmental justice, because this is quite a disruptive civil disobedient movement. They moved away from that now. But the claims from the beginning have actually been pretty, not particularly radical in many senses. They're asking for institutions to tell the truth, so understand climate change as an existential threat. They're asking for immediate action, often by states and international organisations. And they're also asking for more democracy, so they're asking for citizens' assemblies, citizens' climate assemblies, which are hardly the most radical thing going on in the world right now, but we have seen hundreds of them in Europe, and they are being pushed by von der Leyen. They are being experimented with. There have been climate assemblies in the UK, there have been several assemblies in Ireland, in France, not all about climate, but for example in Ireland, one has been about climate change, one has been about one for children to decide about biodiversity protection, and of course the abortion climate assembly, which led to the successful referendum. We've seen them in Germany, we've seen them in Austria, we've seen them at local level. We held a simulation climate assembly in Trento last June with Extinction Rebellion and the university. So, you know, exciting things are happening. So some of these claims are clearly about justice and governmental reform, let's say. How do we make the decisions? How do we bring distributional, recognitional, and inclusion justice into the game? Getting too late for that. Lots of people do more individual action as well, but also collective in the sense of trying to get hold of things they need outside of traditional market systems. That could be through repair, that could be through local community gardens, that could be through gas in Italy. I'm not sure how many Italians there are, so sort of solidaristic buying groups where you buy in bulk and then distribute the goods. Food banks, etc., housing, communities, all of these kinds of things are also really important when we think about climate justice activism from the bottom up. Back to my central point, social movements are part of civil society. Civil society is an important part of how our societies and our international organisations evolve, how we change, how we reform, how we get better, right? So social movements have done lots of things that perhaps if they hadn't been there, we would find it difficult to imagine how these changes took place. Okay, maybe that's too far back, but that's the Chartists asking for the vote in the UK. I don't know which century now. Anyway, long time ago, asking for, you know, ordinary working folk to also have the vote, rotten boroughs, etc. Votes for women. We think about the suffragettes movement. Would women have ever been given the vote by the system that existed back then? I find it hard to imagine. Maybe it would have happened, but much later, I would hazard a guess. Because there's no incentive to change until someone demands it. Yes?
1894 in New Zealand.
Yes, New Zealand earlier. Much earlier. Finland even earlier. So it depends on the country, of course, it depends on the system. But in that system in the UK, that kind of, you know, setup is harder to change, right? Civil rights in the US. And therefore we see what the logic might be. If you think the system needs to change, how do you act when you feel that the system is not changing fast enough? It's not listening, it's not open to some of your ideas, and you're very convinced that those ideas do make sense. And they are well thought out, and they do have a long history. And there is clear reasoning behind them. And there's quite a clear reasoning about what steps might be taken to add democratic inclusion to an existing system in a way that might achieve this kind of change over time. I think I'll leave it there because I've already talked about climate assemblies. Let's just have a look at some challenges. There is rising activism against climate action, which looks very much like wanting to maintain the status quo. Some of that is activism in Europe against elements of the Green Deal. So I know though the farmers' protests are very complex and do have some excellent points, but some of the points against climate protection were informed by the production of information by certain political elements that exaggerated job loss, exaggerated the problems that could be created in food security in Europe, particularly in economies where most food is imported anyway. And many academics and ecologists and biodiversity experts wrote a lot of letters saying this is why this information is wrong. So it's a sort of an interesting thing to think about, is that we seem to be losing consensus around climate action in the European Union, and that's already a couple of years ago. We're also seeing a lot of activism against the external elements of the European Green Deal, often by local communities around extractive projects which are seen as fueling a transition a long way away, which does little to improve a transition or the well-being of the communities around those extractive projects. Again, lithium is a good example there. We're also seeing, obviously, rising rising number of seats in the European Parliament, a rising number of right-wing populist governments or coalition governments in Europe. And there are interesting issues within those parties about climate action. Often they are accused of climate denialism. I think it's more complicated than that. I think there's often an idea that goes back to quite old environmentalism from the turn of the century, that we should protect our nature for our people. And that becomes tricky when we think of climate change as a social justice issue. But it also becomes tricky when we think of climate change as a global issue, because obviously more parochial action has its limits as well, although it is important. So that's another something that we might want to think about in terms of challenging. And often there's not so much attention to justice and democracy in those kinds of political approaches. We've also seen increasing moves, definitely in Europe, to curb that kind of civil disobedience against for climate change action in quite heavy legislation, quite punitive legislation around certain types of protest. We've certainly got a number of activists, even quite elderly folks, still in prison in the UK for having taken part in this kind of disruptive civil disobedience. We've seen it, it's definitely happening in Italy. It's definitely happening in Germany. I mean, it's more targeted against sort of pro-Palestine protesters in Germany, but there is a big trend towards heavy punishment for disruptive activism. That's something else we might want to think about. And here are some questions I thought we could think about when we have a bit of a discussion now. Is climate change falling off the agenda with Trump, with Putin, with rearming Europe, with questions that might look geopolitically much more important in the short term, and understandably so? How do we keep this idea on the agenda? What is sustainable development, really? This is a question that I've tried to sort of point towards throughout the presentation. Can we achieve it? Where can we achieve it? What should it look like? And who for? Are questions that we might want to be raising when we're thinking about this as educators, I guess. And what does active citizenship look like for different folks around climate activism? Because of course, we all do this in different ways. We might be more everyday activists. We might be lying down in the street in our retirement because, we can afford to get arrested sometimes when we are pensioners more easily than we can afford to do it when we are bringing up kids and having to go to work every day. What does this look like? And how can this idea be expressed in ways where we're in a moment where the status quo seems to be rearing its head quite forward? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.